Hello, everybody. This is Robert Barden here at North Carolina State University. I am the host for today's webinar titled Non-Timber Forest Products in the United States, Assess Production Markets and Market Values. As you probably indicated and heard, this webinar is being recorded. We're recording it for on-demand viewing so that others can watch it that weren't able to join today. As we get started with today's webinar, just want a quick reminder, if you're participating for continuing education credits, after today's webinar, we ask that you complete the satisfaction survey and take and pass the short quiz. You'll have a continuing education unit request form to fill out, and you'll have a little box to check that says that you participate in the webinar in its entirety. Once you do that, the system will send you a certificate immediately by email awarding you the continuing education credits. Real quick before we get started, one of the features of the webinar is polling, and we're going to go through a couple polls here. So if you'll take a moment to answer this first polling question, we'd like you to select the category that best represents you. The reason we're asking this information is to give our presenters an idea of where you're participating from. And as you answer that one, our other question is also on what region are you participating from? So if you will also take a moment to fill out the second question. Most of you have completed the poll, so I'm going to bring it to an end, and we'll share those results. And as you can see, we have a mix of people participating today. Everything from those of us that work in extension or education agencies to the government to landowners. And so we thank you for participating. And we have folks participating pretty much all across the time zones of the United States. Thank you for participating and joining us today on our webinar. As I move on, and before I introduce our speakers, I want to remind you, if you do have questions or answers that you would like to ask of our presenters, you'll see at the bottom of your screen, you should probably see a little Q&A icon. If you click on that, go ahead and type your questions in that. We will answer the questions here at the end of today's presentation. So as you get your questions, please enter them into that Q&A feature. And with that, let me introduce our speakers today. Our first speaker will be Dr. Jim Chamberlain. Jim is a research scientist with the USDA Forest Service. He's a global expert on non-timber forest products management, production, and valuation. Jim received his PhD from the College of Natural Resources at Virginia Tech in 2000 with a focus on managing forests for non-timber forest products. He leads and participates in research to quantify and articulate the ecological and economic impacts of harvesting non-timber forest products, particularly edible and medicinal forest products. He has published extensively on the subject, having recently produced a comprehensive national assessment of these products relative to climate change. Jim is currently leading an international task force of more than 65 experts from 25 countries defining and examining the role of non-timber forest products in the bioeconomy. Our second presenter today is Dr. Gregory Fry. Greg is a research forester at the USDA Forest Service Southern Research Station. His work involves using economic methods to evaluate the impacts of forest policy, regulation, and taxes. He also explores themes related to income streams and incentives for keeping forest as forest. Greg received his PhD at NC State University and his previous work for the U.S. Peace Corps in Paraguay, the World Bank, and Virginia State University, Virginia Cooperative Extension. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim to begin sharing his presentation and to start. Jim?
Let's see. Can we do that?
You can.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can. And we're starting to see your screen.
All right. Well, I'm just starting to get comfortable here, so bear with me, folks. There
Looks
we
good,
go.
Jim.
Cool. Thank you. Aloha. And I just want to welcome everybody this morning. Like Bob said, I'm Jim Chamberlain. I work for the Forest Service, and I've been focusing my last 25 years or so on non-timber forest products, and I wanted to share with you today a little bit about what we've been doing and what these products are. But I want to start out with a poll for everybody. Can you, hopefully Bob can help me. And I got two main questions. One is, how much do you know about these products, and everything from nothing to very knowledgeable? We'll start with that first question. And the second question is, what are the topics of most interest regarding these products? So go ahead and do the poll. Looks like everybody's got some knowledge about that. That looks like pretty much everybody's checked in, I see. Yep. Good, so that gives me an idea that everybody's got some knowledge of these products, and it looks like people in general want to know about a little bit of everything, from what the products are to markets and economics. I think we'll cover most of that, sort of production systems, good, some management considerations, some silviculture, and the sustainability of it. Excellent, let's move along then. I'm assuming everybody can hear me okay? If not, pipe in. Right? Now, why won't my slides advance? Let's try this. Okay, so I put this slide up here. You're probably wondering, why would I put a slide up about with a big tree like that? Well, long before people had the ability to cut timber, folks were going out and collecting a variety of products for food, for medicine. So, you know, there's a long tradition of actually using the forest for these products that we consider non-timber or special forest products, or a variety of names like that. You know, so there's a whole, in the United States in particular, there's a really deep culture of people using these products. Everything from the top right-hand corner of your slide, where a local fire department is going out and collecting wild onions or ramps, what we call in the South, or if you're in the North, we call them wild leeks. So there are festivals that are very much part of the communities around here. Down in the lower right-hand corner is a vendor for American ginseng, which is probably the most iconic of the medicinal plants that are being harvested from the US forests. On your lower left-hand side, the woman's holding a big bundle of slippery elm bark, which is stripped from the trees and is used as a throat lozenge. And there's a company that's been around for hundreds of years, and they're still actively selling the throat lozenges. The photo in the middle depicts a family that is out harvesting the leaves of galax, which is a plant that is used internationally in the decorative industry. And interestingly enough, the town, the city of Galax, Virginia, was named after this plant. Back in the early 1800s, a railroad magnate was visiting the town, and people were bringing wagon loads of this leaf to the town and loading it on the train. And he was so impressed, he went back and he convinced the Virginia legislature to rename the city to Galax, and that's the history of how the town got its name. And of course, up in the upper left-hand corner, this woman is looking at a harvest of, looks like sphagnum moss, that is used in the decorative floral industry. So we have this long history. At one point in time, the United States was a major exporter of pine resin. So before the onslaught of ironclad ships, pine resin was used to seal the wood of the hulls. And at one point in time, the U.S. was a major exporter of that. That industry continues, but it is much smaller than it was at one point. So I want to talk about the different market segments that we kind of classify these products into, and basically there are 5 different segments. They can be classified in other ways. I focus more on the markets of them, and you will find that some of these plants and these products, they go across into different markets. So a plant may be a food, and it may be a medicinal as well. So there's a huge variety of products that are used for medicinal plants. This is the season right now for that green plant that you see right in front of you in the middle, or ramps, as we mentioned earlier. They are up and about. This is actually my big data collection season for these plants. I've been going out for the last 20 years and harvesting and measuring and trying to understand the impact that these plants have, that harvesting has on these plants. And unfortunately, because of the virus, the COVID-19, I'm stuck in my house, so I get to look out the window and I see some of these plants growing in my side yard. But at the same time, we've just finished up the maple syrup industry up in your upper left-hand corner. The U.S. is a major producer of maple syrup. And interesting, probably in New England, in the northern states, it's probably $100 million industry easily. And that actually is extending further south now, whereas Virginia and West Virginia and other states are getting more and more active in maple syrup production. One of the big concerns we have nowadays is, in fact, climate change, which is going to be changing the distribution of maple trees, pushing them further north and further north, which could have serious impacts on this industry. I put blueberries up there. Most people think that, well, blueberries are a cultivated product, but in fact, high bush blueberries are a managed product. So up in Maine, folks are actually managing their forests for blueberry production. And years ago, I looked at how the national forests manage for these products, for non-timber forest products. And 2 forests, the Finger Lakes National Forest and the White Mountain National Forest in Vermont, both have had specific management of goals and objectives and silvicultural prescriptions to produce blueberries. So somebody on that, when they were creating the management plan for that national forest, realized and recognized that that plant had economic value for the local communities, and they embraced that and started managing for that. Where I'm living right now, Morels in the upper right-hand corner, are popping out now. People are going out and harvesting them for personal use. In the lower right-hand corner, pine nuts. Interestingly enough, the United States is a major, could be a major producer and export of pine nuts from Southwest Virginia. Excuse me, Southwestern United States. Let's just continue along the way so I don't take up too much time. Medicinal and dietary supplements are probably the largest market segment, certainly the most well-known segment. In the United States, these products cannot be marketed as a medicine unless they are proven to be safe and effective. So they are marketed as dietary supplements. And if you go into any health food store, most drugstores, if you go into Walmart, you can find these products being marketed right in their health food sections. And most of them are wild harvested. There's very little cultivation or production going on for these plants. I've illustrated a few of the major ones. The one in the middle, saw palmetto. The berries of this palmetto are being harvested. The state of Florida is the global source for this medicinal product, this medicinal forest. There's a little bit of harvesting going on in Georgia and in maybe northern Mississippi and areas like that, but primarily that's coming from Florida. Your upper right-hand corner, you see the gentleman, the bearded gentleman showing the stripping of the bark from slippery elm. There is evidence that mortality has been increasing and due to the stripping of the bark. Some other examples, golden seal, wild yam, and black cohosh. Black cohosh is one of the plants that I really focus on. And our research has shown that the harvest of that particular plant is having an impact on populations. We took did an experimental harvest on the plant where we had several different replications and we did science to look at this, and we found that after 3 years there was a significant decline in the populations, and then we stopped harvesting. We monitored that population, and we have not to this day seen a rebound of those populations after that initial harvest. Let's see, we want to go. So the other next market segment that we talk about are sort of the floral and decorative products. And I tell the story, if you go into almost any major large hotel lobby, you will see in vases around the room these curly willow branches that you see up in the upper left-hand corner of this slide. You might see branches of birch trees. You might see pussy willow, like in the middle picture down below. So there's a whole variety of plants and plant parts that are being harvested for floral and decorative items. The back of the pickup truck that you're looking at are Fraser fir seedlings that have been pulled out of the forest and are on their way to Christmas tree farms where they will be transplanted and grown into Christmas trees. Now, at one point in time, what they call pulling these seedlings was very active in western North Carolina at the higher elevations and small parts of Virginia for producing Fraser fir Christmas trees. Now that there's a seed seed tree orchards and seed collection has gotten, production through seed has gotten better, that activity has decreased. But at one point in time, there was a huge part of the industry of actually going out and pulling Christmas trees. The next part that I'd like to talk about are these fine arts and crafts. Now you'll see examples of wood in there. And I will argue that in some cases, non-timber forest products include wood. If that wood does not require the tree to be of timber size, or if it doesn't require the cutting of an entire tree, or basically the timbering of forests, then yes, we might consider that wood product as a fine art and craft. The upper left-hand picture of that, it looks like me, kind of. But that is a carving of cypress knees. And there was a crafter that I came across many years ago, and he was a local guy from around here. And every year he would travel down to the swamps of Georgia and down in that area, and he would cut the cypress knees, and he would bring them back to his garage, and he would carve these things, these little knoblets, you could call them, and market them through craft fairs and things like that. There's, on the lower left-hand corner, you'll see a statue of a vine with some, looks like a little birdhouse, things like that. That's about 4 feet tall. And that is produced by a family company in East Tennessee, where they are actually going out and harvesting that smoke vine and then crafting them into things like that. The company, when I came across them, they were so successful at doing this that they were then hiring local families to help produce these things. This is probably one of the segments that we know very little about because it's hidden or meshed into a larger segment of arts and crafts. And so extracting that information out about this particular part of that market is challenging. And that's one of the big challenges in general of non-timber forest products is how much is being harvested. And the data out there is just lacking. We know we have examples, and I'm sure we'll see come out in this presentation, that large quantities of biomass are being extracted from the forest to make these products, but we just don't have enough data to say comprehensively this is what was included. And then there's the nursery and landscaping. I see in the lower left-hand corner, pine straw, Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, that whole southern belt are major producers of pine straw. People are going in and raking the needles from plantations, and they're taking that out and using it as mulch. People are going out and digging up ferns and azaleas and cactus, and the number of species and plants that are being harvested for nursery stock are astronomical. Anything that somebody will buy, you can be sure that somebody is out there harvesting it. So I have another poll for you. Here's another question. What's your personal connection to these products? I think more and more people out there have a huge connection to them. Very interesting. Wow. Uh-huh. So look at that. Over half of you all have used it, or either use it or have harvested. I wish I'd done a second question. I would ask you, are you using it for personal use, or is anybody out there harvesting for commercial use? But I find that very interesting. So you can see that a large portion of you all, there's this personal connection to these products that we just don't realize. Thank you for answering that question. Let me move along so that I don't, again, use up too much of my time. So let's talk production. And I put this slide up there because the production of these products spans a whole spectrum of forest management. In general, most of these products are what we call wild harvested. So people will go out to the forest at like this time of year, and they forage the forest for these products. So they're walking through the forest, they're looking for their product of their plant of interest. For example, right now, the big plants that are being foraged include ramps, include mushrooms, morel mushrooms in particular. In the fall, people will go out and harvest ginseng. They'll go out and harvest medicinal plants. They'll go out and, so they have different seasons that they actually will go out and wild harvest these things. Now, people have been wild harvesting for, hundreds of years. Hundreds of years they've been out there wild harvesting. And in general, there's very little management that goes on with wild harvesting. Now, some of the more better people and more ethical people will try to do some stewardship activities, like not taking all the plants, or they might put seed back in the ground after they're harvested. They might, if they dig up a root, maybe they'll cut off a portion of that root and put it back in the ground. But in general, we don't really know how much of that goes on, but in general, most people are just going out there and harvesting. You have to can think that a lot of this is open access resources, so there's very little control of the harvest and management of these products. On the other end of the spectrum, we look at integrated forest management, where more and more people are figuring out how to manage that forest for these non-timber products as well as for timber products. Right? Many of our forests in the United States are managed for multiple objectives. We manage for timber, we manage for wildlife, we manage for clean water, we manage for recreation. So now this paradigm that we've been following is shifting over to look at how do we include medicine or food or some of these other non-timber forest products within that forest management concept. And this is fairly new. There are not a lot of examples of that. In the middle, we talk about forest farming, and where people actually are going out and manipulating the forest stand, either the above the canopy or the below the canopy, and they're actually growing these plants. They're farming these plants under the canopy of the trees. And actually, with American ginseng and golden seal, people have been actually cultivating and farming those plants probably 100 years now. So let's talk about wild harvesting. Like I said, people are going out. Either they own land or they don't own land, and probably most people don't own land, but they have access to land, either private land or public land. And at this time of year, they will go out and they wander through the forest. They may have a particular patch that they have been going to year after year after year, and they'll go back to that, and they'll some harvest, or they have a particular region and they'll start working their way through the forest and harvesting that. Now, If you're doing this for personal consumption, where you're harvesting a little bit just for yourself, you want some ramps for a meal here a couple times during the spring, there's probably very little low impact. But when you start thinking about commercial production and you say, well, I need 500 pounds of ramps or 1,000 pounds of black cohosh root, then you're going to start having impacts. And you got to really consider those impacts from the harvesting. Now, some people will say, well, let's just do away with wild harvesting and let's go all to cultivation or forest management. For many people, that's not possible because they don't own the land on which they are wild harvesting. So they don't own land to do that. So they can't shift from wild harvesting to cultivation or to farming. So there's always going to be this aspect of wild harvesting. So my question is, why can't we start figuring out how to manage that activity? So let's talk about now moving to forest farming. And this is one that's really grown in popularity over the last 20 years or so. But as you can see from the first bullet up there, people have been promoting forest farming in this country since back in the 1930s, when this guy J.R. Smith says certain crop-yielding trees could provide useful substitutes for cereal in animal feeds as well as conserve the environment. So he looked at the forest down here and said, hey, this property, this forest could be managed much more productively. And he was really looking at, or the concept that he was looking at was really what we call silvopasture now, because he was interested in, so, okay, can we grow trees and animals and pasture on the same land? But that whole concept started what we call forest farming now, and the production of this understory crop that you see in that picture with a managed canopy above it. The general definition of forest farming talks about the cultivation of understory, high-valued specialty crops. And I would suggest that forest farming is the cultivation or management of understory, and I would place the emphasis on native plants. And they're not necessarily high-valued specialty crops, and that's something we really need to explore more, really understand, and I think Greg will be talking about this later. They're not all high-valued. As a matter of fact, many are marketed as commodities, which have large volumes and low prices, as opposed to a specialty product that has small volumes and high prices. We can do this in established forests or planted forests. So, for example, in a plantation of pine, we might think about producing shiitake mushrooms under the forest canopy, or we might be integrating things like that into a planted forest. It's intensive and deliberate, but it's not necessarily intensive. It could be very extensive. So the person who is forest farming, the ginseng harvester who's out there and they're planting ginseng, they've got their patches that they started 10 years ago, and then they might have another one up the holler further that they started again, another one up the holler again. And so it's really not necessarily intensive. It could be very extensive. But the interesting thing, it introduces a lot more diversity in the forest management and in the forest itself. And this is really where non-timber forest production comes into play. There's a spectrum of forest farming, from woods cultivated to almost a wild simulated. So you got to see the one in the wild simulated. This gentleman he rakes back the leaves, and that's probably a 4-foot kind of strip that he creates by just raking back the leaves, and then he will take his ginseng seed and dribble them throughout that strip, and then he'll walk uphill and rake the leaves down over the area that he just planted. So, and then he's done. He walks away from it. He may come in later and do some weeding, but maybe not. And he'll just let it grow for 10, 15 years and see what he gets. And it's very productive. It's low input, and it's pretty straightforward. On the other hand, you have woods cultivated. And in this photo that you're looking at, this person went in, took off all the vegetation, all the shrubs, the shrub layer, the middle canopy layer. They created raised beds, and then they mulched it with straw. And now they've planted something, probably American ginseng underneath those trees. In some cases, they will amend the soil, and in some cases, they'll put fertilizer and pesticides, things like that down. There's a lot more cost inputs in the woods cultivated, but production is higher, and the premise is you get more for your money. On the other side, wild simulated, there are a lot fewer inputs, and you are not making as much, but you might be better off because of that. There's some challenges with woods cultivated. I tried to do this experimentally, and we ripped off all the vegetation layer. We pulled off all the herbaceous layer, and then we planted. And they came back the next year, and what do you think happened? Well, their weeds were everywhere, and because we had disturbed the seed bank in the soil, and we disturbed some of the root material, and so the competition had increased. So one of the considerations is that you're going to have to come back into that stand and manage it later and later throughout. Right, this just reiterates what I just said. So woods cultivated, we're growing in beds under natural. You might have, it's like gardening. It's like vegetable gardening. It's just like farming, but underneath the trees. I mean, we could get a tiller. People would come in here with a tiller. Obviously, they've created raised beds. So there's a lot of effort to do that. Some of the questions with, there is site preparation that has to happen. You can see that this gentleman, this is in West Virginia, and he's very successful at forest farming, and he has gone in and taken out all the vegetation. You can see that there's not much happening. You can see a few of the plants, the greenery that you're looking at on the forest floor looks like American ginseng, maybe some golden seal. I see some golden seal in there, but you can see that there's a lot of preparation involved in forest farming. Wild simulated, if we can back up for a minute, and well, if you can back up, you'll also see that that gentleman has deer fencing around his we'll call it his garden, so to speak, because that is a major problem in this area of deer will come in and they'll just eat the tops off of that ginseng, and there goes your crop. Wild simulated, again, just to reiterate, it takes a lot longer. You may not get as much of production out. It's very simple and it's very cheap, and you can do it pretty easily. I consider myself wild simulating underneath the trees that are growing in my yard here. I'm growing black cohosh that I've just put in roots there. I put in golden seal, I put in mayapple and ramps. So you're using the natural conditions of the ground. It's very minimal soil disturbance, very minimal inputs. If we talk about integrated forest management, and this is where I think the future of producing non-timber forest products really is. And that's sort of looking at your forest and becoming a true Renaissance forester, so to speak, and trying to figure out, okay, I have this stand of trees, I have this forest, how can I take it back to what it originally looked like with a large, lush understory of ginseng and Solomon seal and golden seal and a variety of great diversity of plant. And how do I produce that product as well as the trees? And so you have to think about a variety of things like integrating the canopy and what's the impact of the canopy has on the plants that are growing below it, right? So we can integrate, we think we have to consider light. So if you open up your canopy, you're going to get more light and more sunlight down there, which changes the moisture regime of that soil. You might get more pests, and again, you'll see the fencing that this guy has put around it. But you can manipulate that canopy. You can take out some of the trees. You could actually pick some of the nice timber trees, take them out, and open up that understory, and which will then increase production of those plants that are growing on the forest floor. We found, for example, with black cohosh, we looked at the relationship between plant production and the canopy, and we found that in fact the amount of black cohosh increased when the canopy was thinned out. So you could actually manage that canopy and increase black cohosh production. So this is my transition slide. I'm going to turn it over to Greg here in a moment. I just want you to remember that one, there are other products from the forest that have value, both ecological value and economic value. So there's a lot more to these forests that we have than just timber. These products can contribute to the economy significantly, and we'll hear more about that in a few minutes, and to the health of the forest that we have. I had a chat a long time ago with a manager of the Biltmore estate, and he said, you should come see our forest. You would be surprised at how little understory there is in our forest. And he said, why do you think that is? And I thought for a moment and pondered on that. And he said, because the original settlers would run their pigs in the forest, and the pigs would root out all the understory plants. So we have this beautiful forest that's growing nice for timber, but there's nothing underneath them. And these products are produced on a whole spectrum of systems, from everything from, going out there and harvesting with no consideration for long-term management, to now there's a new paradigm, shift of the paradigm to agroforestry and forest farming to actually forest management. But remember that most are wild harvested from natural forests with no management. And this is the big challenge that forestry has today. But they could be managed for forest. And we're using accepted silvicultural prescriptions that have been designed for timber production can be modified to produce these non-timber products. And with that, I'm going to slide that over to Greg, and if I can figure out how to mute myself. Let's see. I had it. Whoop.
Okay. Can you all hear me now?
Yes, we can, Greg. We can hear you just fine.
Okay. All right, so you should be able to see my screen now, which is the same slide that Jim just left off on.
We do.
It's a fellow hauling some pine straw. And I was going to say that's a great segue, Jim, into what I'm going to talk about, which is mostly about the markets and market values. So a little bit more on the commercial side of what non-timber forest products are used for. Although we'll touch a little bit on the personal use and other subsistence aspects, as well as access to forest resources and the types of people that may be participating in this harvesting activity. So when we talk about the markets and market values of most non-timber forest products, there's way more about what we don't know than what we do know. And this is for various reasons. First, the demand for a lot of these products is constantly changing as there are fads and trends and the desire for natural products change over time. Also, the supply of various understory plants and fungi can change drastically over time, just seasonally or with different weather and climatic patterns, as well as disturbances like fires and timber harvests, etc., as well as hurricanes and other disturbances. And finally, a lot of the reason why we don't know about non-timber forest products, a lot of the harvesters and traders of these products prefer to operate very informally and in some cases even secretively. And I'll discuss that a little bit more later. So I'm going to tell you kind of some of the things we do know about non-timber forest products market and market values. And first, in order to get into that a little bit, I'm going to give you a little bit of the basics of how we in forest economics would estimate market values of some of these products. So one of the measures we typically use in forest economics, both for timber and non-timber forest products, is something called net present value. And the reason we use net present value is because for long-lived species like trees, as well as a lot of understory species that are perennials, net present value can encapsulate the costs and benefits of this system over a multi-year period. In the case of a non-timber forest product that's harvested for sale, the benefit of or the benefit of a product is the price for which you can sell it on the market, and we usually use the price that is closest to harvest, which is the first point of sale, the first time that the product changes hands for money. And from that price, we will then subtract the cost of both establishing and maintaining the plant, as well as any costs associated with harvesting, processing, or transporting it to market. So in the case of a wild harvested product, for example, there are no, there may be no costs of establishment or management. It's a truly wild resource that no one has been involved in establishing or managing it in the past. So in that case, only the costs of harvesting, processing, and transporting would apply. So then what net present value does is it discounts future years, the costs and benefits of future years relative to the present. So from net present value, to put things on a kind of a common basis, if you have something that takes 5 years to produce versus something that takes 50 years to produce, you want to put those on a common time basis. So we use something called soil expectation value, which is based on net present value, that I described, but rather than like net present value is a finite time horizon, which is kind of the reproductive cycle of that particular plant or fungus species, whereas the soil expectation value just takes that finite time horizon and bases it as if it were on an infinite time horizon. And the main point of doing this, like I said, is just to get things in a to be able to compare apples to apples. But it also what it does is it gives you a value in dollar terms that you can actually compare to what you could buy or sell the land for, if what you could afford to buy or sell the land for if you were planning to use it for that particular purpose. So it's essentially comparable to a land value, which is why it's called soil expectation value. So I bored you all with these economics and math jargon, and now I will tell you a little bit about what the literature has found about some soil expectation values of various non-timber forest products. And as I mentioned before, there's actually not a lot of literature on this in the scientific community. They're very, very understudied in the United States as well as other places, although certain countries do a little bit more than others. But when you look at wild harvesting, one of the things that's been looked into is mushrooming, wild mushrooming in the Pacific Northwest. And they found soil expectation values ranging anywhere from $17 per hectare all the way up to $2,500 per hectare. So that's a pretty wide range. When you look at sort of integrated forest management or managing forests for multiple purposes, there's a couple of products that have been evaluated. One is, as Jim mentioned, the pine straw. So you can manage pine forests to produce both timber and pine straw for mulching. And when you look at this, if you harvest pine straw in addition to timber, that pine straw provides an additional anywhere from $700 per hectare all the way up to $5,100 per hectare over the value of simply managing for timber alone. When you look at in the Pacific Northwest again, noble fir can produce for timber as well as for boughs that are sold for holiday decorations. And harvesting those boughs in addition to the timber value increases the soil expectation value from $325 anywhere up to $4,650 per hectare over managing for timber alone. Finally, to talk about forest farming. So forest farming often will have additional establishment and management costs in addition to any harvesting or transportation costs that you might have with wild harvesting. Some of the literature has actually found that a lot of forest farming systems, because of those establishment costs, actually have net negative rates of return. So they're not necessarily a good investment. But two of the more profitable systems that have been presented in the literature, one of which is Jim has already talked about, is the wild simulated American ginseng production. And at least one source found that this could provide soil expectation values as high as $150,000 per hectare. And Jim also mentioned forest farming of shiitake mushrooms, which rather than on a per hectare basis, on a per log basis, this found a soil expectation value of $11,000 for a system of 500 logs. So I just want to note a few trends with this. First of all, as you can see, there's a wide range of potential returns, even within species, but especially between species and system types. Second, it's definitely possible that more management in some cases can lead to greater returns on investment, but it does have some prerequisites. As Jim mentioned, you can't do forest farming if you don't have tenure or access to land, and also capital that you can invest. So it's just not an option for some people, for a lot of people. Also, forest farming has high risk. If you plant that American ginseng out there, it could get eaten up by deer. There could, as Jim mentioned, there could be weeds that grow in there. there could be theft from humans. So this 150,000 per hectare, that's one point, but there's potentially a lot of uncertainties and risks that that would go into that, and you run the risk of getting a lot less than that as well. Fourth, the wild harvesting has relatively low levels of investment and also relatively low levels of risk, but it does require very specific site conditions. You don't find a lot of these plants and fungi just anywhere. You have to know where to look for them. So that's how I want to transition to this next slide, which is an estimate of the economic value of specific sites for wild harvesting of ginseng, which is based on both economic and ecological modeling. And this look at wild harvesting in the national forests of Pisgah and Nantahala in the mountains of North Carolina. And what you immediately notice is that the vast majority of sites, or about 90% of sites, have basically no ginseng or so little ginseng that it's not worth the cost of your time to go out there to harvest it. Of the remaining sites that do have some value of ginseng, there's an extremely wide range in values, mostly because of differences in site quality and actual how much ginseng is actually out there, but also because the location and topography makes it difficult and more costly to access certain sites. So that's a little bit about the values of producing these products, which is a little bit abstract, I admit. So I want to get a little bit more concrete and talk about people. So who are the people who harvest non-timber forest products? So there's lots of different ways and different types of people that harvest these products. About 1/4 of the general population, we think, which includes people of all races, all ethnicities, genders, ages, education levels, and incomes, apparently, just casually and infrequently may harvest non-timber forest products for their home consumption. On top of that, some people also are more frequent harvesters that we might call subsistence harvesters. And these are also take all types of people all over the country, but subsistence harvesting is particularly common in more remote areas, such as perhaps the interior of Alaska or in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Then you get commercial harvesters, and these can be classified as full-time harvesters or part-time. And a lot of commercial harvesters are people who don't have many other economic opportunities and are sometimes the poorest and most vulnerable people in their communities. Full-time harvesters do exist. They're not common, but they do exist in some parts of the country. And many of them will collect different products throughout the year. And a lot of times these include immigrant populations. Seasonal part-time harvesters generate income frequently on the order of a couple hundred up to maybe a few $1,000s per harvest season, depending on the product or where they are, and how much they do it. Seasonal harvesters, they might do this to undertake this collection activity during, for instance, during a season where their main line of work has a slack period. So construction or agriculture may have less work during certain seasons, like in the winter, and they'll take advantage of that time off to kind of go NTFP harvesting. Or some people will do it when there's like a need for additional income, like around the holiday season when they need a little money to buy presents, or they just want to give these NTFP products themselves as presents. Finally, forest farming as a full-time business is not really documented, but it's not believed to be widespread. Although in one survey, 14% of forest landowners in the US South reported some way, form of managing forests for NTFP production. Now recall, that could be something like raking pine straw. Research really has not focused on forest farmers in the United States, but research in other parts of the world and on other similar types of activities suggests that these, they're likely to be people who actually own land, and they're going to be more educated, higher income, perhaps a little bit younger than your other wild harvesters, and also non-traditional landowners that have multiple objectives for owning their land. So these different harvester types, particularly when you look at like casual versus part-time versus full-time commercial harvesters, they often develop they develop ecological knowledge as well as unwritten cultural norms for how they manage and harvest these products. Of course, not everyone who harvests or cultivates NTFP will follow these kind of rules or norms. They're not really rules, they're unwritten. They're not universal values, but they are things that you find among a lot of harvesters. So one thing is that non-timber forest products can become strongly linked to people's identity and sense of connection to their social groups or cultural groups. And I'll note, just quickly that Native American cultural groups have the longest history of NTFP management and harvest in North Carolina, and generally the most developed ecological knowledge of these plants and products. But other social groups such as African, Asian, European, and Hispanic Americans also have developed NTFP traditions, sometimes in some cases tapping a heritage from their countries of ancestry. And among individuals and groups with long personal experiences, common personal values are respect for nature, stewardship of the resource, and independence. But you kind of see a conflict here between both independence and social connectedness, and there's a little bit of a tension there between those values. And part of that tension also leads to, as well as tension between harvesters perhaps and landowners and land managers, leads people to perhaps in some cases a cultural norm of secrecy. So these kind of conflicting or tensions among cultural norms also can generate a culture of sort of insiders and outsiders between different cultural groups occasionally, or social groups, I should say. And for example, full-time commercial harvesters may use more intensive methods of harvesting, which are perceived as destructive by other maybe part-time or casual or subsistence harvesters. So I have a poll question now, and for some reason I haven't been able to see the answer to the polls when Bob brought them up, but I'll let Bob bring up the poll. And Bob, if you can just tell me what some of the responses are, because for some reason it's not coming up on my computer, but it's the question is where you have collected non-timber forest products from: your own land, someone else's land, or public land, or you just haven't done it. So I'll give you a second to answer that. So Bob, what are the responses coming up there? I'm not sure why I can't see it.
Yeah, I'm not sure why you can't see it either, Greg, but let me end it and share the poll so folks can see it while we talk about it. On my own private land, about 48%. On someone else's private land, 49%. On public land, 49%, and never 14%.
Well, that's really interesting how it's like a really even split there. So let's just talk a little bit about access to private and public lands. So um, obviously with private lands, access is important. If you don't own your own land, how do you get access to a resource that's on somebody else's land potentially? So obviously it's possible to enter into a formal contractual agreement with the landowner. And this is common for specific types of products. It's more common for certain products than it is for others, which I'm going to talk about later. But perhaps more common than contractual agreements are just sort of informal arrangements, just kind of a handshake agreement that between a harvester and a landowner. But it's also possible that there's no agreement or arrangement made at all. A lot of times there is sort of a tradition of these products being perceived as open access, whether that's legally, it may vary a little bit from state to state, whether these resources are really considered legally open access. But there's still a perception that, you know, if I see berries on the edge of the road on your land, I can go grab some. It's not a big deal. But unfortunately, there's a lot of misunderstanding sometime, and this can lead to a situation where somebody either legitimately or not legitimately gets accused of theft or poaching of a resource. On public lands, the interaction between land manager and users can be a bit more complicated, since different user groups may actually have different rights and different restrictions and requirements. Also, land managers may feel an obligation to monitor and limit harvest, which harvesters themselves may view as sort of not necessary or intrusive. So there's a lot of differences of opinion about what is appropriate management between the land managers and harvesters. So if you decide you want to harvest on public lands, this varies a lot from forest to forest, and from, you know, from the federal to the state level. And say you're looking at national forest, even between national forest within the same region may have different rules set up. But frequently what you'll find is that commercial harvesters have to pay a bit of a fee to use the land, whereas sort of personal use harvesters may get a free permit, but they still have to register and get that permit. In some instances, there are actual treaties and traditional rights that are respected, where certain Native American communities may actually have rights to harvest on public lands in certain parts of the country, with or without getting a permit. And again, there may be instances where people either correctly or mistakenly think there is just open access, which can lead to poaching or perceptions of poaching. So once a product is actually harvested from the land, it has to pass through various hands before it is finally purchased and consumed by the final consumer. So we call this a market chain, how a product will pass from a landowner to a harvester, to a dealer, to a processor, to a retailer, and finally to a final consumer. So here's an example of a simplified market chain for a medicinal herb. In this diagram, the dotted arrows represent informal interactions. That is, there's no written record of the transaction, whereas the solid arrows represent formal interactions. So you'll note the following things. First of all, the market chain gets more formal as you advance from the landowner to the harvester towards the final consumer. So it starts out very informal and ends up a lot more formal. Second, this local dealer and a regional dealer can kind of be a linchpin of this whole chain. And these people sort of aggregate supply from multiple harvesters. And what we find is when you compare these market chains from something like medicinal herbs in the Southeast to wild mushrooms in the Pacific Northwest, you find these market chains are extremely similar. Here's a very different type of market chain. This is for pine straw for landscaping. And what you note about this market chain is that more actors are involved, particularly early in the production level. You have landowners, harvesters, labor contractors, and dealers all kind of interacting with each other at the beginning of the process. And also you'll note that there's a lot more formal contracting going on here in this case. And what I noticed, you compare a market structure for pine straw, it's actually quite similar to some other products like saw palmetto, which are both of these products are a lot more kind of highly concentrated in single areas in the forest. Finally, here's a market chain for elderberry, which is a fruit that can be produced for its medicinal properties or also consumed as a food or drink. The market chain here is interesting because berries can come from multiple sources, either from wild populations or cultivated on a farm. And it's also interesting that this processing step uses facilities that can be used by other parallel products. In this case, elderberries can be processed by wineries that are usually used for grapes. So when I went back and I looked at all these different market structures of different products, what are their similarities and differences? I noticed there's a few specific factors that really drive the shape of the market chain and how it works. First, the size of a product and its bulkiness and its kind of dispersion through the forest. So something that's very concentrated in areas versus things that are very spread out affects how landowner harvester interaction occurs, and also of the necessity for having like a market aggregator to combine product, to consolidate product from multiple different harvesters. Second, the degree of processing before final consumption affects the layers of the chain. The perishability and seasonality of the product may influence geographic scale of markets and market players' level of dedication to a single or a few products throughout the year. Fourth, similarities to and complementarities with other types of products may affect how products are transacted and to whom, such as the case of elderberries being transacted to wineries because they're kind of a little bit like grapes. And finally, the location of the demand is important. So in the case of ginseng, most of the product is exported. So is a product consumed locally, domestically, or internationally? This is a ginseng market in Korea that you see in the final picture there. So another poll, Jess wanted you all to guess, in terms of export, or import actually, which NTFP of these four do you think has the largest value imported into the United States? So again, just put those up and then I'll ask Bob to kind of read the number one guess for what you think is the number one NTFP imported into the US.
So it is interest watching the numbers come in. People are responding. And kind of three of them are well, now it's kind of all four of them are bouncing about the same. Let's see if we could give a couple more seconds here for folks to respond. Okay,
That's good. It sounds like it's a pure guess. People are just randomly choosing something.
It does. The one that falls out, Greg, and that might be easier, is foliage and branches. The number one is maple syrup.
Okay. All right. So
that's 29%.
Same question. Okay, good. So same question for exports. What do you think is the NTFP with the largest value exported from the United States?
So we're going to bring this poll to an end and share those results. And what we've seen is 60% of the people responding, ginseng came out as the #1 export, followed way behind by maple syrup at 22%.
Okay, interesting. Maybe because we've been talking a lot about ginseng. All right, so I'm going to show you the actual figures from the U.S. International Trade Commission. The blue bars are imports. The orange bars are exports. So maple sugar is by far the largest of the products for which we have consolidated data. There's a lot of other products out there that may be grouped with other product classes, but these are the ones which we can kind of separate out. Maple syrup, almost 100% from Canada, as you can imagine, is our #1 NTFP import of the ones for which we have these data. The #1 export actually is foliage and branches, which is a lot of this sort of decorative market segment. And a lot, my understanding, a lot of this is exported to Europe to make floral arrangements and things along those lines. But very close behind that is your berries, your blueberries and cranberries and things like that. Okay, so I'm glad to share something new with you that maybe you all didn't already know. Now, when you look at the entire market size, so not just import or export, but things that are traded for domestic consumption, Jim, as well as other scientists, have estimated the entire wholesale market size for these non-timber forest products. So when I look at this chart, the first thing I note is that there is a lot of volatility here. These products show capacity to expand or contract, these markets, I should say, expand or contract by a factor of as much as 2, so like double or cut in half over a relatively short time period. That's a lot of volatility. In this case, we note that the market contracted severely during a period corresponding with the global slowdown in 2008 and 2009, which likely due to a reduction in demand for these products, some of which may be considered sort of luxury or non-essentials. On the other hand, we have evidence from other sources, including some of Jim and mine's work, that more localized slowdowns can lead to an
Hey, Greg,
increase.
can I interrupt for a second?
Yes.
Do you have
Yes.
a little icon showing that says Zoom is sharing your screen, stop sharing, or hide? Can you hit that hide button?
Yes.
Thank you.
So you can see the
bottom of your slide.
the legend there. Okay.
Yep. Sorry about the
Apologies
interruption.
for that. No worries. So we have evidence that more localized slowdowns in the economy can lead to an increase in harvest of a lot of products as newly unemployed people look for income alternatives. So you have these sort of conflicting economic incentives. The second thing I note here on this chart is there isn't really any overall discernible trend in NTFP markets over time. We don't see any real tendency to increase or decrease consistently over time. Now, specific products may trend up or trend down over time, but this is looking at the entire market size of all NTFPs together. So basically, we see a lot of volatility, ups and downs from year to year, but we don't see much of a trend over time. And finally, one last slide here to show you where NTFP markets are located in the United States. And this slide shows where formal registered NTFP businesses may be located. But so we see high levels of formally registered businesses in the Pacific Northwest, where there may be harvesting of greenery, berries, and mushrooms. And the southeastern states of Georgia and Florida may be corresponding to those pine straw and saw palmetto businesses, as well as Midwestern states of Michigan and Minnesota. But the main thing I actually take from this slide is not where formal businesses are, it's more where they aren't, which just tells you more about how informal, how much of this market takes place behind the scenes without any formal record keeping. For example, in West Virginia and Tennessee, we know that there's a large trade in medicinal products, but there's zero registered formal non-timber forest product businesses. So what I take from that is just how much of this market is behind the scenes. There's just so much that we still do not know and still have to learn about non-timber forest products and markets and their market values. So with that sort of cliffhanger, I'm going to finish up here, and we will let, I guess, Bob take over and help us field some questions about some of the things we've talked about today. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
And folks, at this time, if you will please go ahead and enter any questions that you haven't asked yet into the webinar Q&A feature. I appreciate you do that at this time. So we'll start with the questions that have come in. And the first question, actually, let me back up because it is in reference to a slide that Jim, you presented back in the beginning. And I believe it was this slide here. They were asking what the palm is that you were sharing in the screen.
Thanks, Bob. The common name is saw palmetto. I'd have to look up the scientific name for that, but we can do that if you need to.
It's like Serenoa repens or something like that?
That's correct. Yep, absolutely. Yep.
Okay. The next question after that was, what general policies are in place for harvesting non-timber forest products on public land such as national forests, both for personal and commercial uses?
I'll field that one, which I think I may have answered the question, which was it does vary from national forest to national forest. So if you're interested in that, you should contact the local ranger office for that national forest. But typically, it's common for them to issue a free permit for personal use, or a permit that you have to pay for for fee. I'm sorry, these things rhyme. So you have a free permit or a no fee permit versus a fee permit if you are going to use commercial. If you're planning to resell it or harvest over a certain predefined amount.
Okay, the next question that came in through the chat window was, do you have recommendations for forest management for pine straw, specific to loblolly pine, suitable acreage, fire, and understory management?
I think there's been a lot of research that's been done on managing for pine straw. There's a huge body of literature out there. I don't have any specifics at this point, but I'm sure that there's been a lot of work done on how the impacts that removing the pine straw has on soil qualities. There's been a lot of work done on timing the best timing for harvesting, but I don't have any specific recommendations off the top of my head.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I think your cooperative extension office may have more information on that, but I do think you mentioned loblolly, but I think the generally preferred species are slash and longleaf. But loblolly can be harvested under certain conditions. I think there's like a lot more cones and things like that in there that you have to worry about getting out. So it's a little bit harder, and I think they break down a little bit faster than your longleaf.
Thank you, guys. Question on, is forest farming related to permaculture?
Absolutely. Very similar. Yep. They both, I think they harmonize each other very well. Yeah.
Next question is, with the problem of climate change and even the coronavirus being worsened by simplified forest, will cultivation of other than timber products add or subtract to biodiversity?
Tough question. I think that depends on how it's done, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'll let you answer that, Jim. It's a little out of my field.
Well, I mean, if you look at the last part of that question, will cultivation of other than timber products add or subtract? You know, I think, sure, if cultivation of these other products reduces the pressure on natural forests, then sure, it could improve the conservation of forest biodiversity.
Okay. Next question is, have you ever done any research on the serviceberry impacts using it both as a timber product and a non-timber product?
No, I haven't. I didn't know that serviceberry was a timber product. I'd love to talk to you more about that because that's a fascinating concept.
Okay, next question. Would energy from water be considered a non-timber product?
Oh, some people might consider that. I'm kind of the person, I tend to think of things as services versus product. I would put that as more of a service, whereas if the forest is helping you have a more consistent flow of water and thus power a hydroelectric dam, you might consider that to be an ecosystem service from forests. I personally wouldn't call it a product, but hey, these definitions have kind of fuzzy boundaries. So, I think if you wanted to call it that, then a lot of people would be there with you.
Next question is, they're interested in inoculating logs for mushroom production, mixed northern hardwood hemlock forest. Any comments on the pros and cons and suggested species?
Wow.
Oh.
Well, let's see. I think some of the pros are that it gives you a use of small diameter logs. It gives you a product that you can produce underneath your trees without having to do away with the trees. The cons are it's something you need to learn about. The hardwood species most preferred for mushroom production definitely depends on what mushroom you're producing, and the species misses my head right now, but there are lots of different species you use. There's a huge literature on producing mushrooms in forests. Cornell has produced a lot of information and knowledge on producing shiitake mushrooms and other mushrooms as well. So, I mean, I would think I would contact again some cooperative extension people on that. Yep. So Tracy just piped in and said sugar maple, oak, ironwood, yes, are some of the species.
Yeah, especially
So,
for your shiitake.
yeah.
Yes.
Question, how will emerald ash borer affect what you can expect to grow or find in a mature eastern mixed hardwood forest?
Wow. Well, I think the emerald ash borer, as well as all the other pests and diseases that are impacting forests, are going to change significantly what we can grow and what kind of non-timber forest products can grow in that area. I think it could change the forest dynamics significantly, not just the emerald ash borer, but all sorts of stuff.
Okay, this one is directed towards you, Greg. They're wondering, do you usually use a discount rate of 4% when estimating net present value or the soil expectation value?
The rate I personally use depends on the context a lot, but you know, in the literature on non-timber forest products in the United States specifically, and timber, 4% would be a fairly common sort of median rate that people use. So I would say, yeah, that's common here. Other countries, you may have either a higher or lower discount rate. That's common. But I'd say, yeah, 4% is pretty common in the US for both timber and non-timber.
Okay, another one related to NPV. They were wondering, does the pine straw net present value include the cost of fertilization required to maintain growth rate that may be diminished by not having pine straw decaying under the trees?
Okay, so that particular reference, I believe, did consider that factor. I would have to go back and reread it to tell you all the specifics of the work that they did. I think that was, I'm going to butcher that person's name, Susaida et al. 2012. And yeah, I believe that the fertilization aspect was one of the key considerations in that particular study.
Okay, we're going to get through about 2 more questions and then we're going to have to wrap this up. Next question, is there any across the board analysis to one crop under each system, wild integrated farming?
I'm not sure I follow the question. Is there across the board analysis to one crop under each system?
So like producing ginseng under wild integrated and forest farming.
Oh,
is the way I interpret
I see.
that. There's a study that came out of Penn State with Eric Burkhardt and Mike Jacobson, and they looked at different plants and production possibilities. They might have looked at ginseng across that board. Some other analysis came out of Janine Davis and Scott Persons published a book on producing specialty crops and medicinal plants in particular, and they may have done some analysis, but there are 2 sources to look for that answer to that question.
Yeah, I would actually say I don't think there is, because you know, there's just a dearth of valuation of wild harvesting opportunities, because like I said, the wild harvesting is such an informal thing, and in order to do a good valuation of it, you have to know like what the harvesters are doing, and so you have to go interview them, and there's just not many people who have done that. That mushrooming is one of the few studies that has looked at like net present value of wild harvesting. So it's really, there's not much out there.
And to wrap up with this last question, is there a consolidated publication or resource available for small woodland owners who might be interested in growing and harvesting non-timber forest products?
I don't know if there's one there's one single publication, but obviously there's a wealth of resources on various different products individually. Jim led, and he can tell you more, as an assessment of non-timber forest products across the United States. I'm not sure if that would be exactly the resource you're looking for, though. Do you want to tell them about that, Jim?
Sure. I led a team of probably 60 experts from across the United States, and we looked at everything from the economics to the ecological impacts to production methods. And in that, it's a general technical review that came out of the Southern Research Station. So if you Google, or if you just send me an email, I'll get you a copy, or give you a link to where you can get a copy of that. That's got some good production text in it. There are a couple other good pieces. There's a book that came out from Ken Mudge out of Cornell and Steve Gabriel out of Cornell, and they looked at forest farming. Janine Davis has a book that she published 3 or 4 years ago on producing medicinal plants. But I don't think there's any one document.
Okay. I'd like to thank our presenters today for taking the time to pull this all together and answer the questions as best we could get through in the time that was allotted. Sorry if we did not get to your questions. I'm sure Jim and Greg would be happy to, if you got a question you want to follow up with them, reaching out to them, they would be happy to answer those. And with that, I'd like to bring this to an end. Thank you all for joining.
Thanks, everybody. And yes, please do it. Send me an email if you got a question.
Likewise. Thanks. Goodbye.
Bye.